Was there a moment or an inciting incident for you as a writer to say, I want to write about this? What was your...
No, it was more a gradual process. So as a child, I was raised Christian. I liked the biblical stories, but I was always kind of team Pharaoh or team Nebuchadnezzar or team Pontius Pilate.
I've never heard anyone say that. That's very funny.
I was always on the side of the big swaggering empires because I found them more glamorous and exciting. And I found the Greek gods more charismatic, more exciting than the Christian god. So it was never like I had a reverse Damascene, deconversion. It was just like a dimmer switch slowly turning off. And I'd always found Greece and Rome more interesting. I'd always identified my own values and my own identity with them. I kind of thought that is the line of succession. But I found writing about the Romans and the Greeks, I found it quite stressful, actually, psychologically, kind of trying to live inside their heads, because of course, they're not remotely, they're terrifying. Julius Caesar in the conquest of Gaul is said to have killed 1 million people and enslaved another 1 million. And he didn't seem to have any trouble about this. And in fact, he thought it was great and kind of boasted about it. And the Spartans, who I idolized as a child for their defense of Thermopylae, I mean, they provided role models for the Nazis. And
not that there's anything wrong with that.
Well, we might come on to that.
Yeah.
What the role of the Nazis are in current demonology. But I increasingly felt these people are very radically alien. It's not to say that they are immoral. They have a very pronounced sense of morality, but the morality is something very, very different to what I and everyone around me takes for granted. And so I started to, well, what changed? And the conclusion I came to was that essentially it's Christianity that changes everything pretty much. And so that was a kind of idea that was at the back of my mind. And then I wrote a book about the beginnings of Islam that was very controversial because I was dubious about quite a lot that Muslims say about the origins of their faith. I was dubious about the location of Mecca, dubious about the authorship of the Quran, dubious about the details of the life of Muhammad. And I remember giving a talk about this, and there was a Muslim woman in the audience who said to me after I'd given the talk, in the question, why have you done this? You have attacked everything that makes my life worth living in doing this. And it seems that, it's just an act of vandalism. And you would never do this to your own beliefs and your own values. And I felt the force of that because, of course, I was taking a polemical position. Just because I didn't believe in the Muslim God didn't mean that I was therefore neutral. I had a particular perspective as well. But more than that, I was coming to think that my sense of identification with the Enlightenment and with Greece in particular as the origin points for my values, that this was inadequate. And so essentially I wrote Dominion to do to my own beliefs what I'd kind of done to Islam in the book on early Islam, to question, where does it come from? Where does it come from? Is the Enlightenment kind of the equivalent of the Quran supposedly coming from God? Is it like a kind of virgin birth just suddenly appearing? Or might it have roots in what had gone before? And came to the conclusion, well, obviously it has roots in what comes before. And what comes before is the Reformation. But before that, earlier stages of Reformation, and ultimately going back to kind of the biblical texts. And so that was the idea that I wanted to explore and to stress test in writing Dominion.
Well, you start, if I remember correctly, with the cross in the book. Let's talk about that, because the scandal of the cross is something that, as you know and you write about, it's been mostly forgotten. People, they wear crosses around their necks, and they forget the horror of what it is. And when I think of the nightmare of, the Roman Empire crucifying people, when you really think about that, it's very painful. And of course, you just were talking about that. It's disturbing, but it is I guess it's the turning point in some ways of everything that you end up talking about in the book. So start there with that idea.
Well, The book opens with the crucifixion, and the reason I rewrote that after a trip I made to Iraq. So you mentioned in the introduction I've made various documentaries, and one of them was on the Islamic State, and I was making a documentary in 2016 about why the Islamic State had particularly been targeting Christians and Yazidis in the way that they were. And I'm sure your listeners will know who the Yazidis are, but in case they don't, they're a kind of religious minority that were accused by Islamic State not just of being infidels, but of being devil worshippers for reasons that are not valid, but was entirely accepted by the Islamic State. And when we went to Iraq to film this, we went to this town where it had been occupied by the Islamic State. It had been a major center of Yazidi habitation, and the Kurds had just expelled the Islamic State about 3 or 4 weeks before. So I think we were the first Westerners into this place, Sinjar, after the expulsion. And so the Islamic State were about 2 miles away across completely flat and open land, and Sinjar was, absolutely devastated. And it was a place where women had been rounded up and either carted off into slavery if they were attractive enough to be taken as slaves, and girls as young as 8 were being taken away. And those women who were not viewed as being sexually attractive were all killed, and their bones and their hair and their clothes were scattered across the fields beyond the defenses of the Kurds, and we got taken out and went and looked at it. And the other thing that had happened was that the men had all been put to death, and some of them had been crucified. So I stood in this town that still smelt of death. And it smelt of death in a way that a town stormed by the legions would have smelt of death. And it had been captured by people who viewed crucifixion in the way that the Romans had viewed crucifixion, not as an emblem of the triumph of the weak over the strong, but of the reverse. And it opened up this kind of existential abyss for me. It forced me to imagine a world in which the cross was an emblem of power. And the fact that for us, even if you're completely atheist, you would have a sense of that the cross is the emblem of the victim triumphing over the victimizer. But what would a world where that hadn't happened, what would it have been like? So that was one thing, but also to ask, how weird, how strange, how grotesque that an emblem of torture could have come to have the significance that it did. And I was in the midst of researching the chapter I do on Paul, and Paul, of course, is the earliest Christian writer we have. And the cross is at the heart of everything he's writing about. And you have a sense when you read his letters, these are not statements of doctrine. These are someone trying to work out something that is so weird to him that he's struggling to do it. And again, he comes back to the bizarreness of the fact that this guy who suffered this terrible death in some way is a part of the one God who's created the universe. And he says, it's a stumbling block to the Judeans, and it's madness to everyone else, to the Greeks and the Romans. And I think the fact that Christianity so subverted the value system of the world into which it was born, that the cross came to serve for them the opposite of what it had served for the guys who crucified Jesus, lies at the heart of the story of what I wanted to tell. How and why did this happen?
It's, and of course, it's a powerful apologetic for Christian faith. Simply the idea that did happen in history, and you go through the centuries in explaining it. And part of the problem, I was saying, we've lost the scandal of the cross. We've lost the context. Part of the problem as well is that we in the West have so taken in these values that we no longer see them as revolutionary or even as interesting. We kind of assume that everyone in the world has these values, when everyone in the world, even today, you've just described the horror of what they did to the Yazidis and others.
I think you can see this very clearly in the way that Christian portrayals of the cross evolve over the course of the centuries. So Paul's embarrassment, I think, is manifest in his letters, and he's still getting a sense of embarrassment in the writings of Christians in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century. And then even when Constantine, he sees supposedly the vision of the cross in the sky, and the Roman Empire starts to become Christian. But even then, there's a reluctance to portray the cross, and it's not until the beginning of the 5th century that you start to get images of Jesus on the cross. And even then, there's a photo in the book that comes from an ivory casket in the British Museum, and it illustrates the Passion, and it shows Jesus on the cross, and he looks like a quarterback in the shower. He's kind of got his arms spread out. He just looks brilliant. He's really pleased with himself. He's looking incredibly butch, well toned. He's an athlete. He's an athlete who has won in the race of life. There's no sense that this is a man suffering agonies. And it's not until the year 1000 in the Latin West that you first get a portrayal of Jesus dead on the cross. And then over the course of the Middle Ages in Latin Christendom, the idea of Christ's sufferings becomes fundamental to the way that the church and indeed the broader Christian people come to understand what their faith is about. The Passion, the sufferings of Christ are situated at the heart of the liturgy and of art and of spiritual yearning. And there's a sense, I think, in which it ends up desensitizing Christians in the West to just how strange and horrific this process is. So that now we do find it a struggle, I think, to remind ourselves of what the cross was. And I found actually, ironically, that the modern thinker who kind of most vividly understands the strangeness of what happened and the scandal that the Christian kind of almost celebration of the cross is Nietzsche, who in a way is the most potent of all atheists because he takes it so seriously, and he sees it as repellent, the idea that the Christian civilization overturns the worship of the strong, the admiration of greatness that you get in the classical world, and that it kind of, as Nietzsche would put it, fetishizes suffering. And he despises and hates it, but he understands. To properly to despise it, you have to understand how shocking it is.
It's interesting because Hitler essentially echoes that Nietzsche's view. He's repulsed by the glorification of weakness, and he says so. I mean, I've written about it. It's fascinating that he's just repulsed. He wants to worship power and strength, and so he really has no use for Christianity.